My aunt had been gone for 3 days when my mother handed me a small wooden box and said, "She wanted you to have this." My name is Sarah, and until 3 days before that moment, I thought I had a pretty clear picture of my own life. I was 34 years old, I had a job I liked, an apartment I'd spent 2 years making feel like home, and a family that, while small, had always felt steady and safe. My parents had raised me in a quiet suburb outside of Cincinnati, and my Aunt Diane had always been a constant presence. Holidays, birthdays, Sunday dinners when she was in town. She traveled a lot for work. We all knew that. She worked in some kind of international consulting, or at least that's what we'd always been told, and she was gone for months at a time, sometimes longer. But when she was there, she was really there, present, warm, the kind of person who remembered every small thing you'd ever mentioned and asked about it the next time she saw you. She died on a Tuesday. My mother called me at 7 in the morning, and I could tell from the first word she said that something was wrong. Diane had been in an accident while traveling abroad. The details were vague, handled through some kind of government channel my mother didn't fully understand, and by the time I drove to my parents' house that morning, there wasn't much more information than that. An accident. Abroad. The arrangements would be handled. I remember sitting at my parents' kitchen table while my mother made coffee she never drank, and neither of us said very much at all. The funeral was small and quiet, just family and a few people none of us had met before. Serious, well-dressed people who spoke in low voices and didn't stay long. I noticed them but didn't think much about it at the time. Diane had always had a life that existed largely outside of ours, and I assumed these were colleagues of some kind, people from that other world she moved through when she wasn't with us. It was 3 days after the funeral when my mother came to find me in Diane's bedroom, where I'd been helping sort through her things. I had been going slowly, carefully, the way you do when someone is gone and every object feels weighted with something you can't quite name. My mother stood in the doorway for a moment before she came in, and she was holding the box with both hands, and she said, "Diane left specific instructions. This was meant for you. She wanted you to have it after she was gone." The box was small, wooden, with a simple latch on the front. It wasn't locked. I set it on the bed and opened it, and inside there were a few photographs I didn't recognize, a folded document of some kind, and underneath everything else an envelope. A white envelope with my name on the front, written in Diane's handwriting. That careful slanted cursive I'd seen on birthday cards my whole life. I looked up at my mother. She was watching me with an expression I couldn't read, something careful and quiet, and she said, "I think you should read it alone. I'll be downstairs." And then she left, and I sat on the edge of Diane's bed with the envelope in my hands, and for a long moment I just held it. I don't know what I was expecting. A letter about the house, maybe, or some personal message, the kind of thing people leave behind when they've had time to think about what they want to say. I wasn't expecting anything that would require me to sit down, and I was already sitting down, which in hindsight probably should have told me something. I opened the envelope carefully, the way you open something when some part of you already knows it matters, and inside there were two things, a handwritten letter on folded paper, and a separate envelope that was sealed with the Word documents written across the front in the same handwriting. I set the documents aside and unfolded the letter, and I started to read. The first line said, "My darling Sarah, I have loved you every single day of your life, even the days you didn't know I was there." I read that line twice. Then I kept reading slowly, because the words were coming faster than I could process them, and somewhere in the second paragraph my hands started to shake. Diane was my mother, my biological mother. She had carried me, given birth to me, and made the hardest decision of her life when I was 3 weeks old. And the reason she had made that decision, the reason she had placed me in the arms of her sister and walked away, was something I had never in my life imagined, not even close. The letter was 4 pages long, written in that same careful cursive, and I read every word of it twice before I put it down. Diane and a man named James had met during their training. That was how she described it, training, without specifying what kind, though by the time I finished the letter I had a fairly clear picture. They had both been recruited in their mid-20s into an international intelligence operation, the kind that doesn't appear in any public record and isn't discussed in any official capacity. They worked together for years, moving between countries, operating under different names and different identities, doing work that Diane described only in the most careful, measured terms. She didn't give details. She said she couldn't, even now, even in a letter meant only for me. But she said enough. She said that the work was dangerous in a way that was difficult to explain to someone who hadn't lived it. Not dangerous the way people imagine when they watch films about spies, not dramatic or glamorous, but quietly, constantly dangerous, in a way that meant you were never fully off, never fully safe, never fully yourself. And she said that loving someone in that world was its own kind of risk, because the people you loved became the thing that could be used against you. She and James had been careful. They had been together for almost 6 years before I was conceived, and when she found out she was pregnant, they both knew immediately what it meant. Having a child in that life was not something either of them was willing to do. Not because they didn't want me, she was very clear about that, underlined it twice on the page, but because they loved me too much to bring me into a world where my existence could put me in danger, or where I could be taken from them in an instant with no warning and no recourse. So they made a plan. Diane's sister, my mother, Margaret, had been trying to have children for years without success. She and my father had wanted a family more than anything. And so Diane came to her, told her as much as she was able to tell her, and asked her if she would raise me as her own. Margaret said yes before Diane had finished the sentence. My father said yes that same evening. And 3 weeks after I was born, Diane handed me to her sister and got on a plane. She wrote that she had cried for 6 hours on that flight. She wrote that there was not a single day in the 34 years since then that she had not thought about me. She wrote about the birthday cards, the Sunday dinners, the way she had structured her leave around the moment she knew she could be there. My first day of school, my graduation, the day I moved into my first apartment, and she helped me carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs and didn't say a word about what it meant to her to be standing in my home. She had been there for all of it, just not in the way I had known. James, she wrote, had wanted to tell me himself someday. He had talked about it for years, about finding the right moment, the right way. But they had run out of time. They had been on an operation together, the same way they had spent most of their adult lives, and something had gone wrong in a way that neither of them had been able to prevent. She didn't say more than that. She didn't need to. The documents in the sealed envelope were for me. A property in Vermont that Diane had owned for over a decade, 2 bank accounts, and a letter from a legal firm with instructions that had been prepared years in advance. She had been planning this for a long time. She had known that someday I would be sitting exactly where I was sitting, reading exactly what I was reading, and she had made sure that when that moment came, I would have everything I needed. I sat on that bed for a long time after I finished reading. I'm not sure how long. At some point I became aware that the light in the room had changed, that it was later than it had been, and I folded the letter very carefully and put it back in the envelope and held it against my chest for a moment before I stood up. I went downstairs. My mother was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of tea she hadn't touched, and when I walked in she looked up at me and her eyes were already full before I said a single word. I sat down across from her and I put the letter on the table between us and I said, "Mom, how long have you known?" She didn't look away. She said, "Since the beginning. Since the day she brought you to me." I asked her why she hadn't told me. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Because she asked me not to. Because she wanted to be the one to tell you when she thought the time was right. And I promised her I would wait." I looked at her across the table and I said, "Did you love her?" And she said, "She was my sister. I loved her my whole life." We sat there together for a while without talking, and then I picked up my phone and I did something I hadn't done in years. I scrolled back through every photograph I had of Diane and me together. Birthday dinners. Christmas mornings. The photo from my graduation where she was standing just behind my parents, laughing at something someone had said. I looked at her face in every single one of them, and I saw something I hadn't seen before, or maybe something I had always seen and never had a name for. 2 weeks later I drove to Vermont. The property was a small house on the edge of a lake, surrounded by trees, with a porch that faced the water. I stood on that porch for a long time on the first evening, watching the light go down over the lake, and I thought about a woman who had spent 34 years loving me from a careful distance, who had built a life around the edges of mine so that I would always know she was there without ever knowing why. My phone rang while I was standing there. It was my mother, Margaret, and I answered it, and she asked if I had arrived safely, and I said yes, and then she said, "Sarah, I want you to know something. I chose you. Every single day I chose you. You were never second to anything." I held the phone and looked out at the water and I said, "I know, Mom. I know that." She said, "I love Diane. And I love you. And those two things were never in conflict, not for a single day." I said, "I love you too." And then we just stayed on the line together for a little while, not saying anything, listening to each other breathe the way you do when words aren't really the point anymore.